All right, so hello again and welcome to again our next presentation in our academic support series, Essential Study Skills. So today we are going to be discussing tips and strategies that will be aimed at improving your studying. So to kick us off, I want us to just take a second to stop and think about what is our go-to study method. Take a second to reflect on how you typically study and what your typical study habits look like. What typical methods do you use when you're studying? What strategies do you utilize? What are your favorites? What are some things that you generally don't like to use when you're studying? Just take a second to consider that and keep that in your mind as we continue out through our discussion today. So first, let's start off by addressing a few myths or misconceptions about studying. First off, we have heard a couple of these. Let's take a second and just read over the ones that are available on this slide and just have a moment of reflection to think about which ones we've heard before. And as we're going through these, think about the ones that maybe you've heard that aren't on this list. So let's start with number one. The more times you read it, the better you'll learn it. This is one that has been very common over everyone's course of being in school. Oftentimes you'll hear to read, and read again as being a way to absorb information. However, there is no evidence that rereading actually works. The problem is that rereading is pretty passive, and that is something we'll touch on a little bit more later on in our discussion today. Passive versus active learning and studying. With passive learning, your brains remember the information better when you actively engage with it. So doing something like reading passively isn't really going to help you absorb the information that you're studying and that you're reading. And it's certainly not going to help when it comes to recalling that information from your memory. Let's look at myth number two. You should focus on one chunk of material at a time. Research has found that it's more effective to engage in interleaving, and that is a practice that involves mixing different kinds of problems and materials across study sessions or within the same study session. So you can certainly chunk, and what chunking is helping you put together one bit of information at a time. So let's say you're studying something along the lines of biology, and you're studying different cells and what those cells are able to do. When you're studying, it might be helpful for you to study every type of cell at one time versus one cell at a time and trying to attribute individual attributions to each thing. By chunking and studying multiple related subjects at one time, it'll help your brain start making those connections across different information that you're trying to learn. And so myth number three, the more time you spend studying, the better. How many times have you seen people that boast about studying for hours and hours upon hours? And we kind of start to think to ourselves, I certainly can't do that. That's a lot going on there. I know good and well that after about 30 minutes of studying, I'm going to be done. That's pretty common for a lot of people. So maybe you've said so yourself before. I'll just study for 5 hours and I'll be done. And then finally, you'll get burnt out. Burnout is real. You can certainly reach a point of exhaustion when you're studying, in which you're not going to have much of a return on your investment in time in studying. Knowing when to study and when to stop, when to take breaks, when to stretch your legs, go for walks, or just watch TV and turn your brain off for a little bit is going to be extremely helpful when you're studying to help you be better able to maintain that information. Myth number four, you can cram everything at the last minute. So you've known for a while that you have an exam coming up, maybe a quiz or a test, and you think that, hey, it'll be best and fresh in my mind if I try to just study everything at one time, maybe the day before, maybe a couple of hours before. That's something that that will certainly get you into that habit of waiting until the very last minute to get your studying in. But it's important to remember that just because procrastination has worked for you in the past, it doesn't mean it's going to be the best way to learn continuously. Instead of cramming a bunch of information into your head in the twilight hours before an exam or a test, we're going to talk about reviewing your notes in a cyclical fashion. So in a way that is repeated over and over again, and not really just a one point in time way of studying. This is going to help you be better able to recall that information when it is time for you to take a test or exam. And let's look at myth number five. You don't need to develop or improve your study skills. especially when you get to a certain point in your education, particularly in post-secondary education. So when you're in college, you can kind of feel like you're at a point maybe where you've got your study habits kind of routine, you already know what works best for you, and that's what you're going to stay with. But it's important to remember that you can always improve or change your study skills. Especially as you continue throughout your academic journey, you might find that studying for one particular subject in one way isn't going to work in studying for another subject in that same exact way. So you might have to find that you'll need to vary or adjust or change your study habits as you move from subject to subject. And this is where that continuous improvement of your studying is going to come into help. So as you're going through our presentation today, I want you to just keep asking yourself, what myths or misconceptions do I have about studying, and how could that maybe impact the way that I study? So let's ask ourselves this big question. Why do we need to study in the first place? Why can't we just absorb the information? You need to study so that you can help your brain remember the information that you want to remember. For most of us, we can't just listen to a lecture once or read a text one time and immediately absorb all of that information, even though that's what most of us want. We have to continuously, again, improve and work on our studying habits so that we can make sure that we are improving our study skills continuously and always getting to the point where we are working on the best ways to study and remember information. To help kick off our discussion about the best ways for us to study, let's look a little bit at how memory works. When you're studying, you are trying to commit that information to memory. It's important to think about the fact that our brains are processing millions of pieces of information at any point in time. Excuse me one second, I'll make sure my screen is still sharing. There we go. So it's important to remember that our brains are processing millions of information, millions of pieces of information at any one time. There's no wonder with all that information that's being constantly fed into our brains, we can have a little bit of a difficult time trying to actively work to remember such a large influx of information as we are studying. When you're reading or listening to a lecture, your brain is fighting amongst other pieces of information coming in that are being fed in by your senses. These types of information are what's called our sensory information, sensory input, and that's what's going into our sensory memory, our first line of defense when it comes to remembering something. So all the things that your senses are picking up when you're studying, which is why you'll often hear people recommend that you study in a really quiet environment, so any noises, temperature, colors that are around you, things that are going on in the background, those are all going to be things that your sensory part of your brain, your sensory memory is taking in. And when you're trying to study, it can be really difficult to disassociate from the other sensory information that you've got coming in and the information that you're actually trying to absorb. Your sensory memory is created as soon as that information is perceived by your eyes, ears, your nose, your mouth, your touch, all of your senses. And once that part reaches the brain, it only stays in your brain for about 1 to 2 seconds, so not very long at all. But once that information has passed through the sensory level of your brain's going to assess the priority of that information and then decide what needs to go into your short-term memory. And that short-term memory is what deals with the storing of your processed information that's gone through that sensory level processing. Here, the capability of your brain to store information starts from just a few seconds to a few minutes. So while you're studying, you might notice that your brain is taking in that information. And as your brain starts to get past that sensory level and really starts to commit that information to your short-term memory, you're going to notice that things are going to start becoming a little bit easier for you to start remembering or recognizing because your brain has moved that information into your short-term memory. This is where that encoding happens. And encoding is moving that information from your sensory memory to your short-term memory. But having that information in your short-term memory is not going to be enough. Encoding is just the beginning of that process. In order to retain the information has to be moved into your long-term memory. Once your information is moved into your long-term memory, this is where you can store that infinite amount of information. It can remain there for a lifetime. And just because it's remaining there for a lifetime doesn't mean that you'll easily be able to reach that information. So an important caveat to remember is that even though that information is stored in long-term memory from your repeated exposure to it, you'll still need to work to actively retrieve that information so that it won't be lost over time. I'm going to stop sharing for just 1 second because I see someone who is trying to get in, so excuse. So now that we've had an opportunity to really think about or see how some of when we're learning and when we're remembering things, where that information is going through that process of being stored into our memory, let's talk a little bit about improving your memory as you're studying. Because again, when that information is moving from short term to long term, even though it's being stored in that long term memory for an infinite amount of time, you need to actively work to be able to retrieve that information from your short term memory. So what we're going to be talking about at this point in time is how to be able to pull that information when you need it. There are 3 ways that you can retrieve information out of your long-term memory storage, and those are called recall, recognition, and relearning. Looking at our first tip, recalling is what we most often think about when we talk about memory retrieval. That means that you can access that information without cues. So for example, you're recalling information when you're taking practice quizzes, when you're looking at flashcards to answer questions, or when you're taking a test. That is all about you recalling that information. You're trying to immediately pull it out of your long-term memory. Recognition, however, happens when you identify information that you have previously learned by encountering it again. So that recognition involves the process of comparison. When you take a multiple choice test, for example, you're relying on that recognition to help you recognize the correct answers. So how often have you taken a test where maybe you're not entirely sure of what the correct answer is, but you do that little bit of a process of elimination. Oh, I haven't seen this term before. Oh, I haven't seen this term before. Oh, I have seen this term, and this looks really familiar to what this question is asking. That's that process of recognition. That's you pulling that information out of your long-term memory. And lastly, the last memory retrieval tip that I want to share with you today is relearning. And it's just what it sounds like. Relearning involves learning the information that you have previously learned again. This right here helps for you to be able to make sure that you're not missing any important key information, helps you fill in those knowledge gaps that you might have. And so as we continue through our presentation today, we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies that you can use as you're studying to help make sure that you are filling in those knowledge gaps in your long-term memory during that relearning process. But most importantly, just understanding how your memory works is going to help you be able to appropriately plan study techniques that are going to work best for the way that you learn. So now that we have a little bit more of an understanding of how our memory works, let's talk a second about some memory-based strategies that you can use for studying. Let's start at the beginning. How can you decide what you want to study and what you need to know? The answer is by prioritizing what you're trying to learn and memorize, rather than just trying to tackle everything all at once. And it starts with knowing what to know. So when you are studying, you want to make sure that you're working in processes. And a really easy way of working in processes is starting with this quick and simple method of knowing what to know, transferring that what you know to long-term memory, and then strengthening your memory. So let's start with knowing what to know. First, you want to begin by thinking about concepts rather than just facts. Most of the time, you're going to be concerned about learning those key concepts in a subject or course rather than specific facts. Oftentimes, when you are watching a lecture or when you're reading books, you'll notice that your instructor or the book authors will usually highlight key terms, key terminology, and those really important big concepts that are important. Even if they share some additional information that's useful to help you understand the entire concept in a bit more of an understanding fashion, just having those main ideas, those big concepts is what you really need to start focusing on to help identify what it is in particular you need to be studying. Take cues from your instructor. So if you are in a class or watching a lecture, pay attention to what your instructor is writing on the board, what they would mention repeatedly in class, or what they include in their study guides, handouts, or syllabuses where they have their core concepts listed. This is a really great way for you to be able to, again, go ahead and pull out the information that you need to focus on so that you know where to direct your attention. Again, look for things like key terms in your textbooks or ones that your instructors have put on the board in their lectures or any type of handout. And lastly, you can use summaries that are in your textbooks or in articles. Oftentimes, if you flip to the back of your chapter, you'll find a little bit of a summary chapter or a summary section where it's going to summarize all the key points that are being listed out in the text that you've been reading. And that's a really great way to start pulling out those and identifying those big concepts that you need to focus on as you're studying. Now that you know what to learn or what you need to know, let's talk about transferring that information from your short-term to long-term memory. And remember, in our previous discussion of how memory works, we talked about the importance of making an intentional effort to transfer that information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. So some additional strategies that you can use to do that are to start reviewing new material immediately. Remember that people typically forget a significant amount of information within 24 hours of learning it. So even if you're attending class regularly or you're completing your readings regularly, if you are not making sure that you are reacquainting yourself with that information immediately after first hearing it or first learning it, you can start to forget some really important things. And last, you want to make sure that you're studying frequently and for short periods. Remember during our myths and misconceptions that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the fact that sometimes people believe that the longer that you study, the better. The longer that you're focusing on studying, the more you're going to be able to absorb. And we discussed the fact that that is not true. It's a really quick way to head yourself into burnout. So when you're studying, make sure that you are studying for those shorter periods of time. You're going to improve your odds of recalling course information when you need it if you're studying a little bit at a time every day over a certain amount of time rather than one large chunk at one point in time. And the last memory strategy that I want to share with you is just to strengthen your memory. So how can you work to strengthen your memory overall? So people are going to have stronger memories, but others are where they're going to be great at remembering information just at the first time they've heard it. Others are going to have to take a little bit more work. And remember, the point of us discussing these strategies are to find things that work for you. So when you are trying to strengthen your memory, you can do some things like rehearse. Consciously repeat that information over and over again. And then when we go through some more of our study suggestions and our studying habits, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can use rehearsal to practice repeating information in a way that's going to help you remember it. You can also do things like incorporate visuals, so things like note cards, concept maps, or highlighting. Great ways to make sure that text is standing out and that you can easily identify the things that you need to be focusing on. You can do things like create mnemonics, So mnemonic devices are those quick little ways for you to be able to remember information. Things like acronyms or jingles or little songs that'll help you remember how to spell something or maybe what acronyms stand for, or even something like visuals where you're writing out each letter of a word and then associating a concept with it. You can do things like chunking. Remember we talked about chunking earlier, where you organize information that is related to each other in manageable bits. That way you're able to study things that are related to each other together at the same time. So you can help your brain make those connections. And so far, we talked a little bit about how memory works, and I've shared some strategies with you about how you can retrieve information from your long-term memory. But as a student, you're probably aware of the fact that for most of your classes, you're going to have to continuously study materials that you're learning. It's really helpful, in my opinion, to think of studying as a cycle. So when you're studying, again, we don't want to make sure you're studying for just 5 hours, 7, 8 hours at a time where you're not taking breaks. It's best to break up your studying in a way that is spread out over a period of time in a cycle so that you can make sure that you're constantly coming into contact with this information again and making sure that you're really moving that information from your short-term to your long-term memory in a way that's going to make the best sense for you. So here's like a quick little representation of what that study cycle is going to look like. Studying is not a one-off commitment. It's something that as you continue to practice your studying, it's going to help you identify methods that are going to work best for you. So having a cycle that you can be able to refer to is going to help you be able to figure out maybe where you need to start working a little bit in your cycle and where places that you're already doing great in your study cycle. So let's start at the beginning, previewing. Studying can start even before you attend your first class. You could skim through your text or readings or syllabus prior to the start of class so that you could take more of a self-directed learning approach to it. This will allow you to begin actively thinking about the content that you're about to be exposed to and that you're about to learn. Skimming through your readings will have you, you can do things like just checking out the headings, looking for bolded words or words that are italicized that are standing out to you. It can help you start to begin to ask questions. So what could this chapter maybe be about? What could this heading maybe be about? Why is this word highlighted or italicized? Why is it something that's important? As you're doing that previewing section, you can even do things like formulate questions that are coming up so that once you are in class or once you do start diving into your reading or your studying material, you'll have questions that you can refer back to later and answer as you're exposed to that information. The next phase in your study cycle is going to be to attend. When you're attending classes or you're watching lectures or you're listening to a podcast or whatever it may be, you want to make sure that you're actively paying attention. So you want to make sure that you are 100% focusing on the reading that you're doing, the class that you are attending, or the lecture that you're watching over. Make sure also that you're ready to take detailed notes that are easily legible and that are organized in a way that makes sense for you. And we'll dive a little bit more into note-taking within the next few slides. So after you've attended your class or watched your lecture or read your book, it's time for you to, again, review that information. Remember, if you lose information within 24 hours, you're not constantly exposing yourself to it. So we want to make sure that we're reviewing that information pretty soon after we've taken our notes. This part of the study session, study cycle is going to allow you to fill in any gaps. So maybe some questions that you wrote down in your preview section. Maybe you'll be able to find some in your notes gaps that you have where you weren't able to fill in information that you'll have to go back and fill in that information. This is really going to help you make sure that you're completing your notes in the most complete and concise way possible. Next, you'll want to make sure that you actually focus on studying. During this phase in the cycle, you're going to want to work to move that information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. So during this stage, you're going to want to make sure that you're actively engaging with the information that you seek to learn as much and as often as possible. While studying, aim to review your notes as well as develop any study aids like diagrams, flashcards, or charts. And lastly, you'll want to ensure that you're taking some time to consider how this information that you're studying and that you're learning can actually be applied to real life situations, or start to assign that meaning in a way that makes sense for you. And last part of that study cycle is going to be to assess. You're always going to want to make sure that you are assessing your learning to make sure that you are learning in a way that works best for you. So here at this last assessment part of the cycle is where your brain is going to start moving that information from short-term to long-term. To help with this process, it's important to practice active retrieval methods, and we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, so that you'll be ready to take any quizzes or exams. So these are things like blind flashcards, taking practice exams, having a friend quiz you on questions. You may want to also just take a moment to, again, assess the way that you study. If you've taken a test or an exam, check what grade you've gotten on your exam or on your test. Check to see what you've received in terms of what's been correct and what's wrong on your test. And then just have a second to think about, how have I studied and how could I maybe have improved my studying to better understand this concept and this information? And is there anything I can do to change it or improve my studying for the next time I have an exam? Before we move into talking a little bit more about specific study methods, let's talk a little bit about learning styles. So by now you've probably heard about learning styles quite a few times. Knowing your learning style or how you like to learn can be beneficial to helping you stay on track when it comes to your studying and make sure that you're studying in a way that keeps you motivated and helps you to best digest and understand this information. So most people have heard about the three major types of learning styles, which include visual, auditory, tactile, and kinesthetic. So those visual learners are, again, just people who learn through pictures, diagrams, videos, or other visual representation of media. You also have those auditory learners, which maybe prefer to listen to lectures, podcasts, talking out loud with others, or any other form of auditory learners. And then lastly, you have those tactile and kinesthetic learners that like to do things as they are studying or learning. So that can include writing, building, drawing, or interacting with what they're learning in a different way. So some questions that I want you to just keep in mind as you are thinking about these learning styles are, what are some ways that you can maybe use some of the suggestions that you're getting today in a way that's just going to fit with your learning styles? Or how can you even use learning styles to inform the way that you're studying? So note-taking, we're going to talk a little bit for just a few minutes about how to properly take some notes. And what I'll do after we kind of talk a little bit about improving your note-taking is I'm going to show you a couple of examples about how you can take notes. Remember, again, the point of studying is for you to memorize that information. We want to move information from your short term to your long term. So that first, when we have that information in front of us to study, we want to make sure that we are looking at notes that are clear and concise and that have information that's going to be easy for us to easily look over to help process information from short-term to long-term memory. So a really cool way of remembering how to take notes in a way that makes sense in a concise way is to follow the 5 R's: record, reduce, recite, reflect, and review. With recording, you want to make sure that you're recording during your lectures or during class, meaningful information in a legible way, so a way that it's going to make sense for you to go back and read over later. After you've recorded your notes, you want to make sure you reduce. So after your lecture or after class, you want to write a summary of some ideas and facts or key words that stood out to you during the lecture. Summarizing as you're studying can help you to clarify meanings and relationships of ideas, reinforce a continuity, again, strengthen your memory, and then help you to prepare for any exams or quizzes that you have coming up. Third, you want to make sure that you recite. So to properly study, you've got to recite that information in your own words without looking over your notes. So again, as we start to talk about some study habits that you can maybe use as a study strategies, things like flashcards and covering them up and then trying to repeat that information in your own words is going to help you easily and better remember information by moving it from your short-term to your long-term memory. Fourth, we want to make sure that we're reflecting. We want to think about our own opinion and our own ideas as it relates to the information that we're taking in. So raise questions and try to answer them creatively. Record original ideas in your notebooks and review them regularly. And then use those reflections that you've had as a way to study when you're studying for your exams or your quizzes. And last, we want to make sure that we're reviewing any old notes before moving on to new information. So as we're studying under our study cycle, after we've got to the point where we've maybe taken an exam, we've got our feedback on that exam, now we're ready to move on to studying the next part or the next subject or concept in our class. We want to make sure that you really quickly are looking over your last bit of notes, maybe reviewing the flashcards one more time before you move on to digesting that new material. So let's take a second to look at a couple of those note-taking methods. As I explained earlier, when you're taking notes, you want to make sure that you're taking notes in a way that is as concise and as easy for you to use and to remember and clear as you to read as possible. So one of my favorite ways of taking notes is actually by using an outline method. And this is a pretty easy method of taking notes. So with the outline method, you're going to be using indentation to store information and really clear hierarchy like we have listed out here. Using an outline helps to create really meticulous, well-organized notes. These types of notes are really easy to review, and it's a system that allows you to very clearly see space relationships between topics. It's also really easy to revisit and fill in. So this is a great way of taking notes if you're maybe somebody that and you're in a class where your instructor moves really quickly from concept to concept, and you can only take down or jot down a couple of main things at a time. By taking an outline, you can go back in later on and then fill in these little spots with any other additional information that you'd like to. Next is one that people are usually really familiar with, and these are your Cornell notes. So with the Cornell method of note-taking, it was actually developed more than half a century ago, and is a really tried and true method of taking effective notes. It uses two columns, usually called your key ideas or your cues at the top, and then your notes in another column, as well as a single column on the bottom where you'll have a summary. This is a really great way of creating organized and systemic notes that are easy for you to, again, go back in later on and add additional information, highlight important information, or work on your summary in words, your own words, as a way to help you better remember the information that you are currently studying. The last note-taking example I wanted to show you today was just mind mapping. And I also use mind mapping a lot when I'm studying, because this is a really great way to help visualize concepts and how they all connect. With a mind map, it helps you to connect different thoughts, ideas, concepts, and facts all together, again, in a way that is a visual representation of how everything is connected. Mind mapping starts with your main topic in a section in the center. Here in this example, you can see that topic is blood vessels, before branching out to smaller subtopics with supporting details or supporting information that are connected to these subtopics. This method provides a one-of-a-kind graphical overview of content. It's definitely irreplaceable for people that are visual learners. So we've got our notes together, and now we're ready to study. First things first, we've got to get organized. Make sure that when you're ready to study, you've got all of your materials together before you dive into study. You can do things like creating a paper management system where you have any important documents or information, textbooks, articles, things that need to be reviewed right before you get studying. Make sure you've got them all together and centrally located so you can easily access them as you're studying. You want to make sure that you're scheduling the time that you're studying. We'll go through and see a couple of examples of a study plan in a second, but you want to make sure when you're studying that you know how long you're studying for. And again, as we talked about earlier, you don't want to aim to take a really long time to study or to study for long stretches of time. You want to study in those short bursts that allow you to take breaks so that you can avoid being burnt out. It can also be helpful to establish a routine when you're studying. So by establishing a routine, you can get yourself into a habit of knowing exactly what you're going to be doing when you're studying. So again, when we talk about our study plan in the next few slides, we'll see a little bit about how you can get yourself set up for a routine so that when it comes to studying, you don't have to feel like you're always starting from scratch. Make sure again that you're working in an effective workspace for studying. So somewhere that is quiet, free of distractions, because remember, we don't want for our sensory memory to take in any more than it needs to, other than the information that we have sitting in front of us that we're trying to study. So we want to make sure that we're studying somewhere that is quiet, comfortable, and free of distractions. You can also try to create a support system. So if you're the type of person that doesn't want to study alone, maybe you want to make sure that you have classmates that you can regularly study with in group sessions, or that you take advantage of any supplemental instruction, SI offerings that are offered by your class, or even coming to a tutoring session so that you can study with a professional tutor. And lastly, you want to make sure that you create a study plan so that you'll know what to study, when, and how. And so looking at a study plan, let's talk a little bit about why you need a study plan and how you can create one. So why do you need a study plan, first of all? Having a study plan is going to help you navigate through your studying with intention. It holds you accountable for your own learning outcomes. You're the one that's in control of how much you are studying and how you are studying. So having a study plan helps you make sure that you're taking control of what your studying is going to look like. It'll also help you with your time management by eliminating any unnecessary steps in your studying. It'll give you that routine that you can utilize without having to recreate your study plan every time you begin studying for a new course, a new concept, or whatever it may be. So to create a study plan, you want to start off by having a goal. So what are you going to be studying during the session, and what are you going to focus on? And remember, we talked about our memory earlier. One of the things that you can start if you don't even know where to even start at about where to figure out what to study, you can start by looking at headlines in your book, major concepts that were outlined by your instructor, keywords, things like that. Or if you've taken your notes already, you want to look at the things that you've maybe highlighted already, the things that you have written off as key concepts and cues or key ideas, and then focus on that as your goal of what you're going to be focusing on studying during your study session. You want to make sure that you plan your time in your study plan. How long are you planning to study? Make sure you're entering those breaks in there as well. One of my favorite ways of studying is to use a time method like Pomodoro or time blocking, where I'm scheduling 25 to 30 minutes at a time to study, and then building myself in short breaks so that I can have an opportunity to get up and stretch, relax my brain before I get back into my studying. Next, you want to make sure that in your study plan, you have study strategies or techniques that are going to work best for the way that you learn. Remember, we talked earlier about our learning styles. So if you know what your learning style is, or you're trying to figure out what your learning style is, think about ways that you enjoy interacting with learning and that you enjoy interacting with content. So if you are a visual learner, you want to make sure that you've got studying habits or studying techniques in place that are going to help you best to learn visually, like creating concept maps or charts or diagrams. If you're an auditory learner, you want to make sure that you have something like maybe podcasts on the side that can help you better understand the content, or that you're able to speak with a friend and maybe a study group to be able to share ideas and share information that way. So make sure that you, again, in your study plan, have the ways you're going to study listed out. Next, you make sure that you start with your most difficult or time-consuming topic first. So if in your study plan you're studying for multiple classes or multiple content, start by studying the content that is the most difficult for you first. And again, you want to make sure in your study plan, as you're planning out your time, that you're allotting the most time to go to the content that is the most difficult for you to understand. Make sure you notate how long you're going to be planning to study it, and if there's going to be any needed adjustments to your study plan if necessary, if you go over your study time, to make sure you're devoting as much time as possible to that difficult concept or that difficult class. And then lastly, in your study plan, make sure you are routinely assessing and evaluating your study plan and adjusting it as needed. So here are a couple of examples of what some study plans could look like. This was just a really easy overview of a study plan for anatomy and physiology. We've got our goals listed, where we're going to be studying the last 3 chapters in textbooks by studying 1 chapter for 2 hours, 3 times a week. We've got the activities that we're going to be using, and then also making sure that we have any additional reminders, such as a reminder for a study group, or to prepare any type of bingo cards or flashcards or anything. And by having a quick, easy plan like this is something that's very easy to put together. It's not too wordy, and it's something you can easily readjust if necessary. So if something changes, maybe your study group time changes it, you can easily go back to your study plan and change that without having to start all over again. This is another example of a study plan. And this one is actually an example of a 2-week study plan where you've got, you're studying a particular concept or content throughout the entire week. So remember, we're looking at this as a cycle. We're starting by just reading it and highlighting important information and then creating a summary. We're moving on to reviewing, creating more study materials, giving ourselves a break, keeping on with the reviewing of our materials that we've created, and then taking any types of tests or any types of practice exams, and also leaving time for us to review that information again before next week when we're moving on to a different topic. And again, this is a really cool way of making sure that you're regularly interacting with that information, giving yourself an opportunity to keep learning that information and filling in those knowledge gaps as needed. This is another example of that same study plan, but for this one, it's broken up into 2 classes. And so again, this is just a really cool way to show you that when you've got a study plan in place, the point of it is to be easily changeable, easily adjustable, so you don't have to start from scratch every time you go to make a study plan. With this one, we took the same original 2-week study plan that we had created initially, and we just broke it up into including 2 classes. So here we've got things that we need to do for chem class, as well as things for bio classes. And this just shows you, again, how we're giving ourselves multiple times throughout the week to keep interacting with information in various different ways, so that we're continuously exposing ourselves to this information in a way that's going to move it from our short-term to long-term memory without overwhelming ourselves. All right. So next we're going to cover a little bit about passive versus active study. We talked about how our memory works, we talked about our learning styles, and we talked about creating our study plan. So now we're going to talk a little bit about using study techniques that are active study habits and that allow you to actively engage with the information that you're trying to learn. The most important thing to remember when it comes to passive versus active studying is what these two terms just mean in general. Passive studying is what the majority of students do when it comes to studying information for a test, like rereading information or just glancing over things, maybe listening to a lecture or documentary again without much engagement. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's passive. The information is just passively coming through you. You're not really engaging much with it. You're not really checking to make sure that you understand it or trying to make or assign meaning to it. You're basically just being exposed to the information. So when you're studying, what we want to make sure that we're focusing on are doing active studying techniques. And this is when you are going to manipulate or interact with the information in a way that's going to help you better remember and better understand it. And here we've got listed a couple of pros and cons that you're welcome to stop and read that'll give you a little bit more information on why doing an active studying is going to be a better option for you than passive studying. But most importantly, with active studying, we want to make sure that we're focusing on using active studying techniques because this is going to help to make sure that we maintain our motivation. It's going to help to make sure that as you're studying, that you are not only keeping in regular contact with that information, but that you are manipulating it and understanding it in a way and digesting it in a way that seems of interest to you. Without that active participation, that's how you start to get really bored and maybe start to zone out. So you're not really paying too much attention to the information that you're supposed to be digesting. And again, it's also going to help us make sure we're moving that information from that short-term to long-term memory. So here are a few examples of how you can change some passive study strategies into more active study strategies. And as you're looking over these, I want you to stop for a second and ask yourself, what study strategies, active study strategies that I see do I use, or which ones do I not see up here are ones that I use? And just think about a second about which ones, which active strategies you currently are using, and then also think about the ones that your study strategies that might be more passive and how you can maybe make them a little bit more active. Some of my favorite ones are to take really passive strategies like rereading notes or writing with your instructor said word for word, and then taking them and just taking the information and translating it more into where you're identifying those main points or rewriting it in your own words, or creating charts and diagrams that chunk that information together in a way that is more interesting for you to go back and look at. But again, just take a second to look over some of these strategies and consider which strategies you've maybe used before, which ones you might be interested in using, and then if you're using any passive study strategies that can maybe be turned into active strategies. So lastly today, we're going to take a second to look at a couple of study methods and study techniques. These are really easy study methods that you can plug into your study plan and techniques that you can use when you're just interested in trying something new. So as we review these methods, I want you to think about which methods you've tried about before and which ones you maybe haven't tried before. I also want you to consider what has worked when you've studied using these methods and maybe what didn't work. So a couple of the first ones are, this page are SQ3R, and this is a method that people have probably heard about before, but it basically involves a reading comprehension technique that lets you as a studier identify important facts and information and retain that information within your studying. So with that SQ3R, you want to make sure that you are following this acronym-laced method, which is your SQ and your 3 Rs. So survey the information, question the information that you're reviewing, read the information thoroughly, recite it in your own words, and then review that information again. And that's something you'll notice as we go through these study techniques. Most of them are usually going to have the component in there where it talks about you reviewing it. Because again, we want to make sure we are regularly interacting, regularly exposing ourselves to that information as we're studying so that we can move it into our long-term memory and much better recall it when we need to. The next technique is going to be your Feynman technique. And this is an efficient method of learning a concept quickly by explaining it in plain and simple terms. The 5 minute technique is basically based on the idea of if you want to understand something well, try to explain it simply. So basically what that means is you're going to write a concept, explain it in your own words, review it and identify it for any incorrect information, and then rewrite it one more time. And this is going to help you put key information into a way that you would normally say it. So that would better help you be able to remember it in a way that you already talk, that you already maybe remember things in your own mind, so that as you start to recall the information, it won't just be maybe terminology that you don't usually use. It'll be written in terms that you are more familiar with. The next study method I would want to share with everybody is spaced practice or spaced repetition or distributed practice, you may have heard it be called sometimes. And this encourages you to study over a longer period of time instead of just cramming your study sessions into the one night or the 5 hours in one day type of thing. This is a really great way of making sure that, again, as we talked about earlier, we showed you some of those study guides or the study plans that you can use, or you're spacing out your learning over a couple of days. So this is a really cool study method to use if you want something that's kind of telling you how to plan your week out. So day 1, you can learn the material. Day 2, you can just revisit and review it. Day 3, revisit and review it. And these are ways you can make sure that you're using maybe a study technique that works best for your your learning style. And then after a week, revisit and review that information. And after 2 weeks, revisit and review that information. So this is a really great way of making sure that you're continuously coming into contact with that information, not just the week that you're learning it, but after it as well. And the last study method that's going to be on this for here slide is going to be your PQ4R. So another acronym where you've got your PQs and your 4 Rs. So you're going to, with this method, it's more of an active approach to learning that improves your memorization and your understanding of your topic. And it's really similar to the SQ3R method above, except for in this one right here, you're going to kind of preview that information first before you dive into it. You're going to then give yourself an opportunity to question the information. So if you read those headlines that we talked about earlier, what could this maybe be about? Why are these words highlighted? Then you'll give yourself an opportunity to read your notes or read over that information again, reflect on the information that you've absorbed, recite that information in your own words in a way that makes sense to you, and then review it for any gaps or any incorrect information. The last 4 study methods I'm going to share with you all today are going to include the Lettner system. And this is a really cool way for people that are more visual learners, which basically follows a system of taking flashcards and reviewing them in a regular way. So with each flashcard you're going to create, you're going to actually keep them in a couple of boxes. This one right here has 5 boxes listed. So what you'll do is for every card, it's going to start in box 1, your very first box. If you get a card right when you're studying, you're going to move it to your box 2. If you get the card wrong, it's going to stay in the first box. And this is a really great way of just making sure you're going to keep doing that as you're reviewing it. So if you're studying in a way where you're studying maybe daily or over the course of a week, you just start off on day 1, reviewing the information, quizzing yourself on it. If you get it correct, move it to the next box. The next day that you study, you would go back to box 2, review that question again. If you get it correct, move it to the next box, and so on and so on. Next is color coding your notes, and this is something that most people are also very familiar with, whether they recognize it or not. Is a study method. And with color coding, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a dynamic way of color coding information so that things are sticking out in a way that your brain will easily be able to identify what goes in what category, what's important, what's maybe not that important, and what's something that doesn't really need to be focused on immediately. With color coding, just some tips on doing that are to write down these key points maybe in red, because it's going to help you, that's that bolded color that's going to help your brain automatically realize, oh wow, this thing is something that's super important because it's in red. You can highlight information in yellow, which is pretty common. You can also do things like organize different topics by different colors. But most importantly, you want to remember, if color coding is your thing, to not color everything, just the important information, because when you color code everything, that is going to start throwing you off. You won't be able to easily identify and recognize what's important. The third thing is going to be mind mapping. We talked a little bit about mind mapping earlier as a note-taking method, but you can also use it as a study method. With this right here, it's going to follow a similar structure as when you were taking notes. You're going to start by, on a blank piece of paper, having your main idea in the center, and then having all those little connecting subtopics added onto it. This is also a really cool way of doing it, either on paper or you can use an app or some web-based manner of creating a mind map. You can insert pictures, any additional lectures or notes that you might want to add on to those things as you're mind mapping. There's a ton of cool things you can do when it comes to mind mapping. And again, it's a really great way for people that are more visual learners. And lastly, we talked a little bit about that recalling when we're talking about memory, improving your memory. So the last method I wanted to share with you today would be your retrieval practices. And your retrieval practices are just ways that you're going to be able to recall an answer quickly. And so this is ways that are, again, like flashcards, taking things like practice tests or making your own questions. And with these retrieval practices and that recalling is basically just making sure that you are using any type of technique that works best for you, where you are trying to remember that information without any cues. So maybe without any additional information in front of you, you're just trying to close your eyes and remember that information as best as possible. All right, so I know that was a lot of information, and I definitely appreciate listening to all this information today. Make sure if you're watching this on a recording that you stop this recording at any point in time so that you can better read the slides, or just stop and pause and reflect on maybe some of the information that you're being given. But what I want to leave you with today is just a question of how will you improve your studying by using the information that you learned today? And what's something that stood out to you? So with that information in mind and with that question in mind, I want to thank everyone today for joining me. I have our information and our contact information for tasks available here on the screen. If you have any questions about study skills, you would like to talk a little bit more about tutoring services or about study skills services, you are more than welcome to reach out to me or to reach out to TASC.